Hello and welcome to another edition of Rare Together, podcast series from LDA Research that explores the true reality of living with a rare disease. I'm your host, Andrew Grant, and this time we're doing something a little bit different. We have just one guest this time, a guest who's going to give us a different perspective because not only is she a carer for somebody with a rare disease, but she's also a highly active advocate and fundraiser for rare disease sufferers. So I'd like to introduce you straight away to Megan, who is joining us from New York. Hi, Megan. How are you today?
Hi, Andrew. Doing well. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. We're delighted to have you on the podcast. So what I'd like to understand, I know you had a lot to talk about, several things that you're involved in, but it would be great if you could give us the background, tell me a little bit about yourself, and just explain how you came to be involved with rare diseases and tell us something about that.
Sure, of course. I have a son named Domenico. He's 3 years old, and he has a rare disease called FOXG1 syndrome. FOXG1 is a neurodevelopmental disease, which, as a reminder to listeners, this means that he was born with his symptoms. And despite being born with his symptoms, it was still quite difficult for us to diagnose us. So we were on quite a journey initially getting his diagnosis. His disease has a number of different mutations. And so for those not familiar, this just means that his gene has a number of different changes that can happen to it. And the symptoms of each of these mutations can present very differently in FOXG1 children. Domenico is on the more severe end of the spectrum. So he's nonverbal, non-ambulatory. He has no purposeful movements of his hands. He feeds with a G-tube, and he also has epilepsy. So he is very much severely disabled. This is a huge, drastic life change, right? When you have a child who is born with severe disabilities. And I think it was this very situation that pushed me into being an activist.
Okay, yeah. So obviously, as you say, a massive lifestyle change for you. How did it change things for you?
Sure. So initially, every kid that's born, usually in the first month of life, they're not doing much, right? Kids don't do very much in month 1. Month 2 is when you begin to understand your child a little bit. And with Domenico, he wasn't giving much eye contact. He, moving into month 3, wasn't rolling over. He was crying endlessly. I'm talking 6 to 8 hours at a time, just straight crying. And we didn't have any answers as to what was going on. We checked with the pediatricians. I was a first-time mom. He was my firstborn. I have 2 now. And lots of doctors with new moms, they hear lots of new moms coming in with all sorts of complaints. And sometimes it is just colic. In our case, it wasn't colic, but I was told it's probably just colic. And as far as the delays as time went on, I was also told that lots of kids are developmentally delayed these days. So I wasn't really taken super seriously. I think if Domenico was my second child, I would have probably pushed a little harder because I would have said 100% there's a problem. Give me every test in the book. But I think at the time when I was going through it, a part of you wants to believe the doctors too. A part of you wants to believe that he's going to be okay. He's going to sit up soon. He's going to crawl soon, whatever it is. But really, nothing was happening, and my life was mostly changed because he wasn't sleeping. So lots of kids with neurodevelopmental diseases and neurodegenerative, when kids get to that stage, they don't sleep very well. With Domenico, early doors, we were lucky if he slept 2 hours at a time. As he got to be about a year old, we were lucky if he slept 4 hours at a time. So my life changed mostly just because I was a zombie. I was a walking zombie. At the time, we were living in London. Actually, my husband's English, and we had moved over there when Domenico was about 7 months old. So this was still pre-diagnosis. And I was very excited about moving to London. I thought, hey, we can get to Paris on a train on the cheap, and we can go to Italy anytime I want, and on and on. And we didn't do any of those things because I had no sleep, and caring for him was all time consuming. My job, was not able to return to my job after maternity leave, which honestly gave us the opportunity to move to London. But I couldn't return to work because he was requiring too much care, really. And I chose to take care of him, obviously. I couldn't put him in anyone else's hands. Something was severely wrong, and I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to sort of pawn him off. And so we moved to London and we saw a whole new set of doctors there. And frankly, it was more of the same like New York. No one really saw any cause for genetic testing, really. I hadn't known about genetic testing for non-inherited diseases at the time, so I wasn't pushing it. I thought my husband and I are healthy, so, this doesn't have a genetic cause. Today, the amount that I know about molecular biology is just shocking compared to what I knew about it before, but at the time, I knew very little about the rare disease world, really. So I was struggling. I was struggling for answers, and I wasn't being directed in the right places. And we were finally diagnosed when he went for eye surgery. So he had strabismus, which, for the UK listeners is a squint. For the American listeners, it's a lazy eye or just eye crossing. And it was quite severe. And so I researched everything I could about strabismus. And what I learned is that kids with strabismus often have depth perception problems, and they may also have double vision problems. So I guess we were hoping that maybe lots of his issues were related to his eyes. If he could see the floor better, find the floor better, maybe
Okay.
he can jump better and maybe he can sit up better. So we went in for that double eye surgery. And 2 days later, he began his first seizures. And it was there at CHOP in Philly where we saw a great neurologist who, put together all of the symptoms alongside the seizures and immediately put us through for genetic testing. And that's how he was diagnosed.
Wow. Okay. And at what age was he at that point?
So we got the test back about 6 weeks later. So he was 16 months old.
Right. Okay. So it's a long journey to that stage. And what was your reaction to that diagnosis?
Well, the neurologist actually, who we had seen, was a bit familiar with FOXG1, and he had guessed that it might be FOXG1. So in those 6 weeks, we researched a lot about the disease and what was going on with the disease. So I guess hearing that it was FOXG1 wasn't, obviously it was very hard, but it wasn't as shocking as maybe as it could have been. I think the shocking moment was actually learning about genetic testing, learning that he could have a non-inherited genetic disease and what that meant. Knowing that he may have a severe disease that is caused due to his genes. And this could be something that we're not going to get out of. This could be something that he's not going to grow out of. That's not just a short-term developmental delay. That whole period of understanding that was hard. Getting the diagnosis itself was actually relieving in a way because it was 16 months of a hard time in my life. It really was I was a complete recluse. I didn't always shower. I definitely didn't go out for walks. I was on no sleep. I was a zombie. I describe it as military grade sleep deprivation. It's really what it's like. It was hard. It's a hard moment in my life. So once we had the diagnosis, now it meant, okay, we know what's wrong. We can figure out how best to care for him now, right? We can get better help. We can get better, doctors who are experts in the different things that we need for his symptoms. And we were also introduced into a community of people who had FOXG1, which was also extremely important and helpful.
Okay. So what's the prognosis now for Domenico?
Well, unfortunately, most kids with FOXG1 do have a shorter lifespan. 30% of them die before age 3. He's 3 now. Most of them don't live to age 30. We take every precaution to avoid that. Of course, we're familiar with the typical reasons why FOXG1 kids die, and we do our best to avoid it, but most of the time it's not avoidable, right? Every parent before us tried to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't really know. We're just living day by day. We are working to raise money for research, and there are some great researchers around the world who are studying FOXG1. So really, his prognosis is for life when we find a gene therapy or a repurposed drug or a stem cell therapy that works for him.
Mm-hmm. Right. Understood. So tell me then how you then started thinking about fundraising. How did that begin for you?
Yeah, so I think that once we understood what the disease was, and, as I mentioned, we had researched it a little bit, we knew we had to help. We knew we had to find a cure. And I think my push for it was also based on how hard the experience before was, going through. It's one thing when you're going through these symptoms with a child, and it's another thing when you're going through them and no one's really listening to you. So that was it's almost like it amplified the gravity of the symptoms, and you just live with those symptoms in such a different way. And that experience, as I mentioned, was really hard. So it propelled me into launching the Children's Rare Disorders Fund 3 months after we got diagnosis. So right away, we knew we had to start raising money. And research is, of course, very expensive. And you don't have many people helping you to raise money for rare diseases. So it does very much fall on the shoulders of the parents. And so we were just another set of parents who were ready to start raising money.
Okay, so you say a set of parents. So you recruited other people? Were you the driving force? Was somebody else the driving force? How did it kind of come together?
Sure. So there are two other research organizations who work on FOXG1 research.
Okay.
And so we're the third set of parents who began to raise money for FOXG1, essentially. We came along a little bit differently, maybe, than the other groups. One of the groups in particular not only does research, but they also manage the community, the parent community. So they're, making sure that parents are being taken care of as much as possible, right? The second organization is more about fundraising. He's more like us. He's more about getting money in. He's doing a lot of great research too. And then we came along. We didn't want to recreate the wheel in any way, but we wanted to have our own organization because it's a little bit easier to fundraise when it's your organization versus picking up the phone or reaching out to businesses and asking them to donate to someone else's organization, right?
Okay.
So for us, it made more sense for us to have our own. And secondarily, we didn't want it to only be about FOXG1. And the reason for that is because when we were diagnosed, and I say we because as a parent with a kid who's severely disabled, it's almost like you take on the disease yourself, right? It becomes like you're sharing it in a way with your kid. But anyhow, so when we got the diagnosis, one of the neurologists who told us about the disease had said that no one's working on research. When we went home, we found out that many people were working on research. And so I always kind of look back at that day because and when I was in that darkest time of my life when he really wasn't sleeping, he's sleeping better now, not through the night, but he's sleeping better. When I was in that darkest period of my life, it was getting up in the morning was made much easier when I knew people were working on research to cure him. And so I've always looked back at that day and I think about what about all of the families who have that same conversation, go home, Google, and find out that no one's working on their kid's disease? And what about those families who aren't in my situation and both parents still have to work? Maybe they're even working two jobs and no one in their disease community has the time, energy, whatever it is, to put together a charity. Essentially, there are thousands of rare diseases that don't have patient advocacy charities working on research for their kid. That is a very, very tough existence, and I don't think it's fair. And so we created the Children's Rare Disorders Fund to, yes, fundraise for my son, fundraise for kids like him, fundraise for FOXG1. But our longer term goal is to replicate successes on those rare diseases that don't have anyone working for them. We hope that we will find a gene therapy or a drug or whatever it is. Once you do, it's fairly simple to replicate that on the next rare disease, right? It takes money. There's going to be a lot of money involved, but replicating it is possible, right? And it should be under the same roof. It should be with a team of scientists and researchers who have done it before and can easily replicate it versus asking people to start over from scratch, really. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So that's kind of the long-term goal with the CRD fund. And fingers crossed we get there and we're able to not only help our kids, but touch a lot of other lives as well.
Okay. Okay. Understood. So, tell me how you go about raising money for a cause like that. I mean, you talked about picking up the phone and speaking to businesses. I mean, is that the main way?
No, There are lots of different ways, I guess, but it's not an easy process. I think that initially most parents who begin a patient advocacy organization that's funding research begin by asking their friends and family, right? You try to get everyone you know to donate. And if you're lucky, sometimes people can bring in a good amount of money that way. Lots of times you can't. Lots of times it's your friends and family don't have that kind of money. The next step really to earn sizable money is with grants.
Okay.
So there's a couple of different online systems that manage grants. They basically include lists of all available grants. And I know this is true for both the US and the UK. And you simply log in and you search, or you have someone search for all grants that might be applicable to your cause. And then you simply apply online. And in those cases, you can get a $5,000 grant, you can get a $50,000 grant, or sometimes more. And so this is really where some of the money can come in that can be a little bit more substantial. When it comes to businesses, it depends on the size of the business. You want to aim for larger businesses because they have more money, but at the same time, larger businesses usually already have the charities that they support and limitations. So it ends up being the smaller businesses who are happy to donate, but then they're also donating smaller amounts. So targeting businesses actually can be difficult. It can be like targeting friends and family. And those are also situations where you can't expect everyone to be a yearly donor, right? Because everyone has other places that they'd also like to donate to. So it's hard. Raising money is extremely difficult.
So tell me how you then take that money and turn that into research. What is the process by which you've been able to do that?
Sure. So with research, I think it begins with your own research and understanding what might work for the disease that you're working on. So we've spent a lot of hours just understanding everything we can about gene therapy and stem cell therapy and drug repurposing. It got to the point where I was considering a master's in biology. I used to work in fashion and advertising, and now I'm studying molecular biology in
Right.
my free time. It's kind of crazy how much a rare disease can completely reshape someone's life when you're the caregiver, right? When you want to make a change in the space. And so that's how it begins. It begins with understanding the research. And then once you understand the research that's available to you, your next step is to go and contact all of the researchers. You have to start reaching out to the labs. You have to schedule calls. You have to hear firsthand what's happening, what they're doing. And if they think that what they're doing can be applied to the disease that you're looking at, right? You also need to develop your own research team.
Okay.
Because ultimately, as a parent, unless you are trained, you really shouldn't be making a decision about research. You can find the research and you can talk to the researchers, but another researcher should really make those decisions because they'll understand it much better than you will, right? And so that's your other step, developing your medical board, developing your scientific team so that they can vet the projects really after you have. Lots of times these medical teams are unpaid, so you can't really ask them to do the research for you. It becomes your job. You have to find the research, you have to vet the research, then you have to request proposals from the labs, and then you have to pass those over to your research team who can then make a decision about whether or not they the proposals make sense and are priced correctly and all of those things.
Okay. So how did you go about finding those people to volunteer to do that for you?
Also research. So again, you're just trying to find the players in your space. FOXG1 is a disease that has had researchers working on it for years sometimes, not necessarily to find a cure, but just to understand the biology of the gene, right? You have researchers all around the world just studying different genes to understand how they work. FOXG1 is an interesting one because it affects so many other genes in the brain. So you'll find that it can cause or be very related to other problems. For example, it's related to autism, it's related to Alzheimer's. So it's just an interesting gene for researchers to study.
Okay.
And so we found a FOXG1 researcher in Freiburg, Germany, named Tanya Vogel, and she became our head of research. she's been studying Fox-G1 for many years. So we were lucky. We were lucky to find Tanya, and we were lucky that she wasn't in any sort of conflicting assignment. She also acts as the head of research for Fox-G1 Deutschland. So Fox-G1 Germany has their division, and she also supports them.
Right. It sounds like you've built quite a structure in what sounds like a relatively short space of time. I mean, we're only talking about what, 15, 18 months since you started doing this, is that right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's been a short time, and as I mentioned before, I think that a lot of that has to do with just that harsh period that I went through. It just really propels you to figure things out as quickly as you can, because it isn't any way for anyone to live. And with Domenico being on the more severe end of Fox-G1, you don't want him to have that life forever. Lots of people with less severe diagnoses come from the perspective of like, I don't want to totally change my child. This is their personality. But it's different when you have a kid who can't talk and can't walk and can't use his hands and can't communicate. That's different. In these cases, at least I can speak for myself. I want my kid to walk. I want my kid to talk. I want him to play with toys. I want him to open up the gifts that he gets on Christmas. I want him to be able to do all those things. So, yes, I want to change my son. I want to rid him of this disease because I want him to be able to function in this world using all of his abilities. I can understand accepting the idea of accepting your kid for who they are. And I do, of course, I accept my son. But an outsider who says that isn't there while your son's having 60 seizures in a day, and they're not there while your son's crying endlessly all day. Even friends and family, if they're over and they see Domenico on a good moment, they don't really understand how many bad moments there are and why I wouldn't want that for him. So I think going through so many bad moments just pushes you to want to get rid of all of them, if that makes sense.
No, completely. Yes, I can see that's an enormous driver. Just so I understand, so you've explained that he doesn't speak, he doesn't walk, he can't use his hands. But I'm assuming that you are able to kind of read him. You can communicate with him to a certain extent. I'm assuming, or am I guessing that?
Yeah, no, we can communicate with him. He doesn't really respond.
Right.
So we will get some noises out of him sometimes, where they're perfectly timed for whatever's happening, where we feel like he's there, he understands what's happening, and it almost feels like he wants to communicate, and that's our perception of it anyway. But I think it's very difficult sometimes to understand a child in his situation's communication style when the eye contact isn't there, right? He has a really difficult time with eye contact, and he's 3, so things do change, I think, as the kids age a little bit. Some of the kids, for example, on his severe side, they learn to use switches, which are buttons that have voice recordings on them. So imagine a red button that when you press it, it says no, and a green button when you press it, it says yes. So some of these kids can use these buttons. Some kids can do much more than that. Some kids can type whole sentences using switches, using these buttons. Kids can use an eye gaze, which is basically like a tablet where you can communicate with your eyes. So if you stare at the photo of the water long enough, the machine will say water. And if you stare at the machine, the photo of Aladdin long enough, the machine will say, I want to watch Aladdin, or whatever it is that you program the machine to do. So we're trying both. We're trying switches with him. We're trying the eye gaze with him. The therapists do think that he will be able to find a way to communicate. We're just not there. And that could just be a factor of his age.
Right. Understood. Do you suffer from a rare disease, or do you know someone who does? If you do, I'd like to take a moment to point you in the direction of the Rare Disease Network. It's a private support group on Facebook where we bring together people with all sorts of rare diseases from all over the world. You'll find exclusive research and insights. You'll get the chance to ask questions to leading medical professionals, and you'll hear some engaging and inspirational stories from my growing community. There's a link to the group in the episode notes below. Why not click on that, and we'll see you there. But I'm assuming that you've learned to, I don't know, read his moods, his reactions to a certain extent, given,
Well, he cries. He can cry. So if he's not liking something, he will cry. And that happens every time we do physical therapy, for example. So he can definitely tell us when he's unhappy. Other than that, it can be difficult. It can be really difficult. We don't really know when he's thirsty or when he's hungry or if he's hot or if he's cold. There's no real way for him to communicate those things. So we just have to do our best guessing. If we feel cold, he must feel cold, right? And feeding, he has a G tube. So feeding's just a schedule. And sometimes we do think that some of his cries are related to hunger. So we'll feed him a little earlier at those times. But it's hard to say. It's really hard to judge.
I can't imagine how difficult that must be. My heart goes out to you.
Thank you.
So, sorry, coming back to the fundraising. So, have you been doing all this on your own, or are there other parents who are involved in helping you to do this?
So the first organization that I mentioned earlier is managing the parents. So they're managing the community and the parents. So we don't really ask the parents to help us out too much because we don't think it's fair to ask them to support multiple organizations. So we are running it ourselves and with volunteers. So we have both friends and family volunteers as well as just good-hearted people across America who have volunteered their time as part of the organization. We have a grant writer, for example, and she won us our first grant. Her kid has a rare disease that's not FOXG1, and they have a patient community of 4. So she was really happy to get involved with a bigger organization. We're doing our best.
And in terms of the progress you've made in actually funding research, have you got to that stage, or are you still evaluating potential researchers, or where are you at now?
Yeah, so for FOXG1 research in general, there are a number of projects underway in gene therapy and drug repurposing. For CRD specifically, we're working on drug repurposing right now, and we're potentially funding another project related to the biology of FOXG1 that will help support the other projects that are at play.
Okay, understood. And in terms of repurposing, are there any particularly interesting candidates, or is it still too early to tell?
Too early to tell, but we're only about a month away from hearing some news about the candidates. Things are moving in a great direction, which I'm really excited about. And with this particular study, we will get back a list of candidates that we can actually test immediately since they're all FDA-approved drugs.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, that's great. All right. So now I know that as well as doing all that you've just described, you're also involved in something else. So please tell us what that other thing is.
Yeah. So about a year after launching the Children's Rare Disorders Fund, I decided to launch Rare Parenting. Rare Parenting is an online magazine for parents of children with disabilities and special needs. As I mentioned, I worked in that industry once before. My career essentially died when Domenico was born, when I became his full-time carer. So I'm more or less using my skills from my previous life and moving them into the special needs world. And this is in reaction to everything that's happened in these past 3+ years, from when we didn't have any answers and I couldn't find any information online to sort of teach me about what was going on, right through to his symptoms, even to today, symptoms that he has. What happens when you have a kid with a severe disorder, you have a symptom and generally you first go to your pediatrician. Your pediatrician really can't help with symptoms that are related to the disease because they don't have much experience with them. So then you move to your neurologist, but your neurologist can't help you with GI issues, right? So they're going to refer you to a GI. Of course, previously you didn't know you needed a GI, as you would have went to them first, right? And so this is sort of the process. And sometimes you're waiting for those doctor's appointments. And so you end up getting answers through the parent community. Lots of times we were able to solve our problems by asking other parents about the symptoms, and the parents end up diagnosing us, which is amazing. And I'm so grateful for all the wonderful people that I've met. But it shouldn't really have to be this way. There should be information online that is medically backed, that it includes doctors' opinions, that includes parents' thoughts and opinions, and that is professionally written, magazine style. And that's what rare parenting is. So, rare parenting takes a journalistic approach. We have professional journalists from places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Fortune, Forbes, Parents, Baby Center. These are all of our writers and editors. And they get assigned stories that are related to this community. And then they research the stories. They interview doctors, they interview parents, and then they produce the article. And then the last step is that a doctor will read through the article to make sure everything is correct. And then from there, the parents that come across the articles can know doctors were included, parents were included, and there was a final check from a doctor. So it's medically backed information that they can trust, essentially. And this doesn't exist for our space. Parents and Baby Center are two great examples where this exists for the general parent community. They also medically back their health articles, but it doesn't exist for us. And that to me was shocking. So right now we're just producing article after article of all of the topics that I personally wish were covered, as well as lots of topics that don't concern me necessarily, because it isn't all about me or severe disorders. We range from ADHD right through to severe neurological disorders like Domenico. So we're covering a wide range of topics, and it's all parenting advice. So you'll never see my story on there or Domenico's story on there, or even an article of what is FOXG1, because all of this stuff you can find other places. There are lots of wonderful parent stories that newspapers will write about and magazines will write about. This instead is really just about the symptoms that parents go through and, what is genetic testing? What does that look like? Do I need to have my kid genetically tested again because I didn't get results the first time? And why would I need to do it a second time? And what are the signs and symptoms of sensory processing disorder? And what is occupational therapy? Why is that different from physical therapy? And why does my nonverbal child need speech therapy? I don't understand that. And so on and so forth. So it's just all of these questions that parents have all in a pretty place. So they can go and they can find the information that they need. And that's what I've been spending most of my time on these days.
Okay.
Creating all of these articles and creating this website and creating this resource for the community.
So how have you managed to fund that then? Because you've obviously got some very professional writers involved.
It is not cheap, that is for sure. My husband and I are the investors in Rare Parenting.
Okay.
Decided to invest in it because of the need. This is a highly underserved market. We're underserved because of the research. We don't have enough funding for research. We're underserved because of the care and even getting through Medicaid, the Medicaid process in the US, or getting the right services in the UK through the NHS. All of it is such a struggle. It is all such a terrible, awful struggle. We're not supported enough. This is one teeny way that I feel that I can support this community, and that's by getting people answers faster, right? So instead of waiting sometimes months for the right doctor appointment, read this article. If this sounds like it could be your kid, then you need to see this expert versus this expert, right? And so that's really what it is. Here's the symptoms, and here's the next path that you need to take to help your child. So we're basically directing people, we're teaching them about what's going on, and then we're directing them on what the next step is for them to take to treat their child, right? What is the right doctor that you're supposed to see at this point? And this saves a lot of time because oftentimes in any medical system, you have to see one doctor before you can see the next doctor, before you see the next doctor. And this way, we just tell you right away, this is the specialist that you need to see. And so you can just go ahead and book more quickly and get things done faster. And lots of times there might be an over-the-counter drug. When you're dealing with acid reflux, for example, those are drugs that you can get over the counter. You don't necessarily need to see a doctor to you get diagnosed that way. And that actually happened to us. Domenico had severe acid reflux. And in kids with severe neurological disorders, acid reflux can look like seizures. It's very, very crazy, really, what happens with severe acid reflux. And it makes it difficult for even the best doctors to diagnose or to understand. And in that scenario where he had that acid reflux, it was the parents who said, "Oh, that's just acid reflux. Go buy XYZ from the pharmacy. You can buy it over the counter." And in 2 days, he was cured. And so there are certain circumstances where you don't necessarily need extreme evaluation. You just
Yep.
need someone to teach you about what's going on. And like I said, this information should exist online. It
Right.
should be so grueling for parents.
Yeah. And what is the biggest thing you'd like to see change? What's apart from providing that information as you're attempting to do, um, what would you like to see change in terms of the system and how children are diagnosed with, or even adults for that matter, with rare diseases?
I think that there needs to be more global awareness of rare diseases. So if you compare it to cancer, everyone understands cancer and everyone understands that there are multiple forms of cancer. And each of these forms of cancer usually end with the word cancer: ovarian cancer, breast cancer, testicular cancer, whatever it is. When you have rare diseases, they don't end with the phrase rare disease. Fox-Schuon syndrome, or they're named by the gene without anything after, or they're called a disease, but not a rare disease. So when people learn about rare diseases, they don't really understand how many they are and how many people are affected by them. There are more people affected by rare diseases than cancer and AIDS combined. Yet there seems to be a lack of global understanding and awareness. And I think part of it is a branding problem. I think part of it is for that reason. And the reason, aside from the fact that there needs to be more global awareness, there needs to be a better understanding, because the kids can get faster, better treatment if everyone understands what rare diseases are. So if you look at the pediatrician level, pediatricians also, like anyone else, don't necessarily see rare diseases as being collective, whereas many of the signs and symptoms of one severe neurological disease are very similar to the next. So pediatricians, for example, need to be trained on just what the common signs and symptoms are so that they can then diagnose or forward the child to a neurologist more quickly. And that's not really happening right now. Instead, what's happening is that most kids are being told, most parents are being told to do the wait and see approach. Let's see what happens. Let's see how the kid develops. And that's just because a lot of kids do develop more slowly. Um, However, in cases where you have a severe disorder behind it, delaying can be detrimental, and not just to the family and the weight on our shoulders, but to the child. The earlier you intervene, the better their outcome, right? The earlier you start them on physical therapy or speech therapy or whatever it is, the better chance they have of developing some of those skills, right?
Right.
And so I think there needs to be overall more awareness so that kids can get diagnosed faster. That would be the change I'd like to see in the world: faster diagnoses.
That's really interesting what you said. So, you're kind of saying that we ought to stop using the term rare disease. That's kind of one of the fundamental problems that we're saying it's rare, therefore people aren't looking for
Oh,
it. But
right.
yeah,
Yeah, so we joke when we say rare diseases are rare, but collectively we're not, because
right.
each disease is rare, right? But collectively we're the opposite of rare. And so it can be like a debate. Do we call ourselves rare? Do we not call ourselves rare? Ultimately, each of the kids ended up being a rare kid, really, but collectively we're not rare. I mean, if we could rebrand every disease to have rare disease at the end of the name of the disease, that would be amazing, because then people, doctors, everyone that comes across a disease will be more likely to put them together. Oh, I saw another kid with a rare disease and he also had these symptoms. Or someone comes into the office, oh, I saw this other kid, he ended up getting diagnosed with XYZ rare disease. Maybe he needs genetic testing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Right. No, that's really interesting. That's something I've never thought of before. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is an issue there. Um, Way at the beginning when you were talking about the whole pathway to Domenico's diagnosis, um, I know you said that you didn't necessarily push perhaps as hard as you could. It was your first child. You wanted to believe what they were saying and hope that that was correct. Um, did you feel that even when you got to the stage you felt it was necessary to have some kind of genetic testing. Did you feel there was any resistance? Were you kind of, was there pushback and people saying, oh, you don't need that?
Yeah, well, in the beginning, as much as I wanted to believe the doctors, we did push on. Between New York and London, we must have seen 7 different pediatricians, and not one of them had recommended genetic testing. So I did continue to take him for second and third and seventh opinions because it was a really hard moment. So the problem there wasn't really pushback necessarily. It was just that no one was recommending genetic testing. No one was saying, go see a neurologist. I even remember saying to one doctor, maybe we should go see a neurologist. And they were like, yeah, you can if you want, sort of like that. And one doctor actually had mentioned early intervention. I know there's something similar in the UK. I just can't remember what it was called. Early intervention is when you bring in therapists, like a physical therapist and an occupational therapist, to evaluate your child, potentially work with your child. And this system works really well for kids who are developmentally delayed, who eventually grow out of it, right? It works very nicely. But
Right.
for kids who have genetic components involved that can't grow out of it, that program actually delays genetic testing because first you have all of these other therapists seeing your kids, and then eventually you go see a neurologist. So the change that needs to happen there is that the doctors need to say, you can do early intervention or you can go see a neurologist or you can do both, right? And we were never really told maybe he should see a neurologist. So it never really crossed our mind that it could be genetically based or neurologically based, right? When we were finally offered genetic testing, it was because of the seizures. So when the doctor taught us about non-inherited diseases and told us we should be genetically tested, we were completely gung-ho. And there was no pushback from anyone. It was their recommendation at CHOP. So we 100% were like, okay, this hopefully will give us answers.
Understood. Yeah, so this is the kind of things that we've heard from so many other people we've spoken to on the podcast. It's that long path to a diagnosis that when you look back, it could have been a much better process, could have been a much quicker process, and therefore you could have had an earlier intervention. It's such a common story that we come across.
Yeah, and part of it is what happened to us. Lots of parents do go through what we go through where, they're having trouble having a doctor really listen to them or pay attention to them or recommend genetic testing, and they don't know any better either. But then other times, the part of the reason for the delay is because they're given a genetic test that doesn't necessarily have the gene that has the affected mutation that their child has, right? So genetic testing, again, that's a misunderstanding of genetic testing. When you take a genetic test, it's not testing for everything in the book, which but you do assume that if it comes back clean, it means your kid does not have a genetic disorder. And for lots of families, that's not the case. For lots of families, they have to do a second genetic test, a third genetic test, or sometimes they have to do a complete genetic test of the whole genome, right? Which is called whole genome sequencing or whole exome sequencing. Sometimes they can do. And this is also something that parents don't know anything about. We certainly didn't know anything about it. Right now on Rare Parenting, you can find a whole article about genetic testing and about what it all means and the different types of tests that you should have. And so this often delays diagnosis for many people. A third reason why people can be delayed with a diagnosis is because they can be misdiagnosed. So even in our community, lots of the kids were initially diagnosed as having cerebral palsy or having autism. Cerebral palsy and autism are 2 diseases that you can have your child diagnosed with without genetic testing. So in those cases, you're sort of branded a disease that your kid maybe doesn't necessarily have. And in those cases, what happens is that usually it's a bit later in life when parents say, hey, I want to get my kid genetically tested. And then they find out what disease the kid actually has. This is really important for parents to know about because if there's the chance that their kid's disease is one of the fewer diseases that has a treatment or a gene therapy, something closer to a cure, then their kid isn't being cared for correctly, right? And then also the symptoms, how I mentioned I have this wonderful parent community that I can rely on. If you find out your kid's actual underlying disease, it opens up a different world to you and it makes it a bit easier for you to care for your kid, even if there isn't a current treatment. So it's really important all times to have your kid genetically tested, especially if you have any suspicion that your current diagnosis does not perfectly match your kid's symptoms.
Right. Understood. Yeah. So even if you have a diagnosis, it may not be exactly the right one.
And I do find it happens a lot, specifically with cerebral palsy and autism. So there are lots of misdiagnoses in there. And that's just because of the fact that you don't necessarily need a genetic component. There are, of course, certain types of autism that do have a related gene. But most of the time when people are diagnosed with autism, there wasn't any genetic testing performed.
Right. Understood. Well, Megan, wow, fantastic. We've covered a lot, and thank you so much. You've given us a huge amount of information. So, before we finish, how can people get involved? Whether they want to maybe donate to the fund, or whether they want to go and take a look at rare parenting. Where do they find these two things?
Sure. The name of the charity is the Children's Rare Disorders Fund, and the website is thecrdfund.com. Of course, we would appreciate any donations. And as for rare parenting, that's simply rareparenting.com. All of the content is there. As I mentioned, there's no paywall, so anyone can go on freely. You can sign up for our newsletter. Likewise, if you have suggestions, if you're going through a tough moment yourself and you'd like us to produce a certain article catered towards your needs, let us know. You can either send us an email, you can write to info@rareparenting.com, or you can reach us in social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. Shoot us a message. Tell us what you need, because our job really is to support this community. And so we'll produce articles endlessly until we feel like all of the needs are met.
We'll of course put the links to both of those along with the podcast to make sure that people can contact you. Megan, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I'm really
Good.
impressed with what you've done. You've turned a difficult situation into something incredibly positive as far as I can see, and more power to you. So well done for that. To the audience, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please let us know. Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Have a look at Megan's two sites. I'm sure there's a lot to be learned there, a lot to be gained, even if you're already heavily involved in this area. It sounds like Rare Parenting certainly has a lot of content which is going to be useful to you. And don't forget to subscribe to these podcasts. Make sure you don't miss out. And if you know anybody else who might like to join in the conversation, please do share the link with them so that they can get involved too. We also have a Facebook group, which is called the Rare Disease Network. And you can find us there. You can communicate with us there. And if you have any thoughts about other podcasts, then of course, we'd love to know. So again, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Megan. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I wish you all the luck in the future, all the best in the future. I hope Domenico continues to improve. And we look forward to maybe speaking to you again in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Andrew.